So this is the final lecture of the semester, looking at the series of events that comprises the second half of the Cousins War and the emergence of the Tudor dynasty, which for all intents and purposes sort of ends the medieval period in England and ushers in the early modern period. So where we left off in 1455, after a brief period as protector of the realm, in the absence of Henry VI, who wasn't really able to rule because of his sort of mental challenges. We see Richard of York banished from court because once Henry sort of returns to a position of lucidity, he explains to his wife, or his wife explains to him what had happened, and in particular really sort of identifies Richard of York as the cause of all their problems. So Richard is banished in exile, and he, and along with a lot of other barons who are not happy with Marguerite's position at court or with the influence she and Somerset wield over the king, engage in one of the first sort of major battles of the Cousins War. So this is the first Battle of St. Albans. It's fairly small scale, as you can see. It is a victory for the Yorkist forces, and so they're able to reduce Henry VI to essentially a puppet king. There is, though, a lot of division amongst the nobles as to who should really be the real authority. So Marguerite and Somerset have been marginalized, but those who sort of support Richard are a little concerned about his ambitions. And this is not sort of laid to rest. In 1460, he kind of pretends to claim the throne. So everyone's in this council room. He sort of just sits on the throne, probably testing the waters, hoping that people will say, hey, yeah, this is the perfect solution. That does not happen. And so even the barons who oppose Henry VI and Marguerite are not quite ready to see Richard crowned. Obviously, Marguerite and Somerset are conspiring against him. So in 1460, Parliament intervenes and tries to provide a diplomatic legislative solution and passing the Act of Accord. And essentially what it does is it says, look, we recognize that dynastically speaking, Richard of York has a better claim to the throne than Henry, but Henry is the third in the Lancastrian line. And so you're not just going to depose a sitting king. At least not this time. Essentially, then what it says is that after Henry VI dies, and he is a little bit older than Richard, Richard will succeed. This disinherits Henry and Marguerite's son, Edward, Prince of Wales. And so Marguerite and Somerset muster an army and march north. Richard of York and his second eldest son, Edmund, retire to Sandal Castle for winter. They declare sort of a Christmas truce. So his sons sort of disperse, and Richard and Edmund go to Sandal. However, right during the Christmas truce, the Lancastrian forces show up outside of Sandal Castle, which you can see pictured here. There is a small group of Lancastrians who are spotted, apparently sort of foraging. Richard and his son Edmund decide that they're going to go out and confront them for violating this truce. What they find, however, is a much larger army that's laying in ambush, and the Yorkist forces are outnumbered by about 3-1. York is killed on the battlefield. His son Edmund, who's about 16 at the time, is taken prisoner. But then while he's held captive, Clifford, one of the nobles on the Lancastrian side, sort of looks for him, searches him out, and then personally slits his throat. So it's becoming very vindictive. Clifford holds York accountable for the death of his own father, and so revenge really plays a huge role in all of this conflict. The heads of York and Edmund are severed from their body, and Marguerite has them put on pikes and displayed along the walls at the central gate of the city of York as a very public demonstration of York's death. However, what she does not account for is York's youngest son, Edward, who is only 18, who was the Earl of March and now by right inherits the Duchy of York as well. So Edward becomes the Duke of York, and he raises his own forces. So in February, he engages the Lancastrians at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. And right before battle, there's this sort of strange astronomical configuration called a parhelion, where because of things going on in the sky, it looks like there are three suns. Normally, these types of omens are not sort of viewed as promising. And so what Edward does is when he sees it, to sort of calm his troops, he says, oh, it represents the three surviving sons of the Duke of York, because there are still three of them. He's a very, very effective battle commander in spite of his youth. They defeat the Lancastrians. And in the aftermath of battle, again, continuing this very sort of vindictive turn, he has Owen Tudor, remember, is Henry VI's half brother. He has Owen Tudor beheaded. This is going to have implications in the future. So then, trying to build upon their victory at Mortimer's Cross, the Earl of Warwick, who is Edward's uncle by marriage, it's his mother's brother. Earl of Warwick is the most powerful man in England. He is wealthier than the king. He supports the Yorkist cause. He has a very large army, about 10,000 men. He hears that the Lancastrians are marching south, and so he tries to intercept them in a decisive engagement. He actually there's some confusion about where the Lancastrian forces are. He thinks they're somewhere they're not. There's a lot of disarray on the battlefield. Warwick ends up fleeing the field of battle. In his haste, he forgets King Henry, which you can see sort of pictured here. His brother, John, the Earl of Montague, is taken captive. And the Lancastrian forces, after sort of the dust clears and the Yorkists have fled, find Henry sort of under a tree, guarded by two Yorkist soldiers. They're able to sort of reconnect with the king, who's not fully aware of sort of what's going on. But now that they have the king, obviously their position is significantly bolstered. Shortly after that, the Battle of Towton is fought. This is one of the bloodiest battles, if not the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. You can kind of see from this digital replication here the size. So you're talking about maybe close to 80,000 men on both sides fighting. Edward, who is now Duke of York, leads the Yorkist forces. It's Palm Sunday. There is snow, which is sort of unusual at that time of the year. They engage in the morning, and one of the things that's happened is that because of the snow, the Lancastrian archers are really ineffective because they're trying to shoot into the wind. The other thing that happens is that sort of reinforcements arrive on the Yorkist flank, and this is just a long, long battle, 10 hours of hand-to-hand fighting, and so the men just literally are sort of worn down, and then that sort of last surge of Yorkist forces is able to turn the tide of battle in favor of the Yorkists. Henry VI, once again, changes hands. He's captured by the Yorkist forces. In the aftermath of Towton, it's actually one of the few battle sites where we can definitively prove a battle occurred, in part because of the mass graves that were dug after the fact. There are a number of sites like this one here that are subject to current archaeological investigation. In one instance, there's sort of a mass grave of almost 200 men who clearly show signs of death by battle wounds. We know that after the battle, the Lancastrians who were taken prisoner, one by one, 42 of them are beheaded. Marguerite and her son Edward flee to the royal court at France, and this leaves the path forward for Edward to march on London. The Yorkists have always been very popular in London, so the Londoners sort of open their gates and welcome him in. So in June of 1461, although only 19, Edward IV is crowned the King of England. And he's sort of a typical York. He's very tall. He's considered very handsome and very charming. While it's very clear that Edward has the royal claim and he has proven himself on the battlefield, he does have to sort of allow his uncle Warwick, whose sort of nickname is the Kingmaker, to play a prominent position at court. And this is going to lead to further conflict moving forward. So Henry VI is in the custody of Edward. Marguerite and her son are in France. Marguerite is trying to get the backing of her French relatives. Her uncle is the king. She's trying to get their backing to raise an army and return to England. In order to sort of counteract that, Edward sends the Earl of Warwick, his uncle, to France to negotiate a truce. Warwick spends a number of months trying to convince the French that a truce is in their best interest. Obviously, on the heels of the 100 Years' War, there's still some bad blood. He promises an alliance against the Burgundians. The Burgundians and the French are at odds. Typically, England and Burgundy have been strong allies. And so this is really sort of upending the status quo. The central piece to this truce that Warwick negotiates, it's a huge coup for him in persuading the French to go along with this. But a central component is marriage of a daughter of the royal family of France to Edward IV. When Warwick returns, he sort of reveals his victory to Edward. He tells him about this proposed marriage. And this is when Edward is forced to reveal that for the past few months, he has secretly been married to this woman here, Elizabeth Woodville. This secret marriage is kind of astonishing for a number of reasons. One, because Edward is such a prominent figure, to marry secretly is really just very unusual. Second, Elizabeth Woodville is older than Edward. She's about 10 years older than he is. And third, Elizabeth Woodville is a Lancastrian. Her husband actually fought on the side of the Lancastrian forces, and she has 2 sons from him, and he was eventually executed because of that. So on a number of fronts, this seems to be an odd choice. What we do know is that Edward was very impulsive, especially when it came to the ladies, and that Elizabeth is reported to have been just stunningly beautiful and also very intelligent. However, Warwick, when he finds out that Edward has married behind his back and made such a unfavorable alliance, is absolutely fuming, to such an extent that he picks a fight with Edward and begins secret negotiations with Marguerite d'Anjou. And any sort of appreciation for the extent of Warwick's anger is illustrated by his willingness to ally with his formerly greatest enemy in Marguerite and in the Duke of Somerset, her ally. Warwick convinces George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's younger brother, so this is also Warwick's nephew, to join forces with him. And he marries George to his eldest daughter, Isabel. Warwick doesn't have any sons. He has 2 daughters. And so they stand to inherit his vast estates and wealth. So this is a very favorable marriage for George. Warwick also tells George that his plan is to maybe replace Edward with George, so George can become king. In the meantime, to prove good faith on the sides of these 2 that were formerly bitter enemies, Warwick marries his younger daughter Anne, who's about 14, to Marguerite's son Edward, who's about 15. And this sort of secures this very odd alliance between these 2. So Marguerite then is able to bring money from the royal court in France, and then Warwick is able to provide the troops from amongst his own retainers and from amongst mercenaries. This is an image, a sketch of Anne Neville. So she is married to Prince Edward, who is on the left there. Later, however, she will become Queen of England, not through marriage to Prince Edward, but through marriage to Prince Richard, but we're not there yet. So in 1470, then Warwick invades. He catches Edward off guard. Edward did not realize the strength of Warwick's position or the number of men that he had at his disposal. So Edward and his youngest brother Richard flee to the court at Burgundy. Their sister is married to the Duke of Burgundy. This is the house where they stayed for several months. A very wealthy local merchant sort of puts them up. Warwick then marches to London. He frees Henry VI. He restores him to the throne. However, everybody realizes that Henry VI, he's not as out of it as he was for that one period, but he's still not in a position to rule. All of this sort of infighting and violence have sort of made his condition deteriorate further. So it's very clear that he has just become a puppet of Warwick. There's still a lot of animosity between Warwick, his supporters, and the supporters of Marguerite. Marguerite and Warwick, once they are sort of victorious, also sort of are at odds over who's really going to call the shots. And there's absolute chaos across the countryside. They're not able to maintain law and order. So the popular opinion very much swings against these new developments. However, they prove to be short-lived. In 1471 of March, Edward returns. He engages the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Barnet. You can see that Edward here, and then Lord Hastings has the van, and Edward's younger brother Richard, who's the Duke of Gloucester, has the other flank. The Battle of Barnet is also sort of significant in terms of size. Warwick and his brother Montague have about 15,000 men, and the Yorkists have about 10. The problem here is the fog. Edward moves his men into position under the cover of dark, and so they're closer than Warwick thinks they are. So Warwick actually is using artillery, sort of cannons, throughout sort of the early morning to try and take out some of Edward's forces. He doesn't realize how close they are, so the cannons sort of miss their mark. So when the sun comes up, initially there's a lot of fog and there's also a lot of smoke in the air, and so Edward is able to catch Warwick's forces by surprise. You can also see from the way the battle lines up, they've sort of missed each other. So Gloucester is able to flank the Lancastrians there on the right, which puts them into a very effective battle position. Unfortunately, the same thing happens with the Lancastrian forces. So Oxford is able to inflict a lot of damage onto Hastings' troops. However, when Hastings' men break ranks, Oxford's troops follow them to Barnet. And then when they sort of regroup and return, again, because of the fog, they think they're marching to sort of support Warwick, but Montague's forces mistake the badges of the men fighting for Oxford, and they think that he's actually attacking them. And so the two sides, the two Lancastrian forces attack each other, and eventually Warwick, in his attempt to flee the battlefield, is killed. Montague is killed, and Marguerite and Edward do have reinforcements, but they arrive too late, and so this is a huge victory for Edward. He follows that up in May of 1471. Marguerite flees, but she returns with more forces. She is sort of in the central part of England, and Jasper Tudor, who is Owen Tudor's younger brother, so he is also Henry's half-brother. He has an army of Welshmen. They're trying to connect their two armies, and so Marguerite is trying to cross the River Severn. Before she can do that, though, Edward chases her down and intercepts her army and forces it to turn and fight. Tewkesbury is a decisive victory for Richard. Not only does he just decimate Lancastrian forces, one of the people who's killed is Edward, the Prince of Wales. And in the absence of her son, this leaves Marguerite very little to fight for. And so she no longer is as adamant about restoring Henry because she doesn't see sort of any future gain. So Finally, Edward is able to return to his throne in London to restore order. On the 21st of May, 1471, King Henry mysteriously dies. They say he died in his sleep. He's probably killed. As long as Henry's alive, there are people who are attempting to return him to the throne, and so Edward eliminates that threat. Edward attempts to reconcile a lot of these Lancastrians with the Yorkists through marriage. He really does believe that this is the way forward to establish permanent peace. He does have in his wife Elizabeth Woodville a lot of potential marriage partners. Elizabeth had 13 brothers and sisters. Between her two marriages, she has 12 children. A lot of these Woodvilles then are married to Lancastrians. They're also married to Yorkists. However, this attempt to sort of solve some of this conflict through marriage in part backfires because a lot of other nobles are very jealous of these advantageous marriages that are going to the Queen's family, who sort of are viewed as upstarts. And so Edward is able to sort of, with his personality and his charm, overcome some of these rifts. But it is going to sort of lead to problems moving forward. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, marries Anne Neville. Once Edward, Prince of Wales, is dead, Anne is free to marry. And then through Anne, Richard gains those Warwick lands in part. This creates a lot of conflict with his older brother, George. George, remember, was married to Isabel. George was pardoned by Edward for his role in the rebellion under Warwick, but he continues to create lots of controversies. We don't have time to go into all those controversies. Eventually, after a false accusation of witchcraft, he is imprisoned, and he becomes such a liability to Edward that he is executed. That's in quotes because he's actually drowned in a vat of wine. And so George, who is pictured here, then is removed from the picture, leaving just Edward and his younger brother, Richard. Richard is very active, securing the border in the north on Edward's behalf. So the final phase then comes in April of 1483 when Edward IV dies. He dies fairly young. He's only in his early 50s, but he is not in the best shape. He is probably overweight. He drinks a lot, and he doesn't get the exercise that he used to. His death, however, shocks everybody. He does have a son, Edward, who's 12, and so his younger brother, Richard, is declared by Edward, King Edward, to be the protector of the realm. So to kind of organize everybody and consolidate the nobles behind young Prince Edward. But this is a lot of concern to a lot of nobles who remember the last time there was a minor as king and all the damage that resulted from the conflict amongst various nobles. So there's a lot of concern there for what's going to happen to young Prince Edward. Richard seems to share this concern about his nephews. On June 22nd, 1483, Parliament declares Edward and Richard illegitimate. There are some questions regarding the legitimacy of King Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. Remember, it was in secret. There is some cause to believe that they might in fact be illegitimate. Historians are very divided on this. The consensus really is, though, it was a trumped up charge to avoid another extended minority rule. And so on July 6th, Richard is crowned Richard III. As you can see from this contemporary portrait here, he does not look anything like Shakespeare's Richard III. He was a very successful military commander. He was very shrewd. He was very, very loyal to his brother Edward. However, he was operating from a position of disadvantage because most of his power was concentrated in the north, where he preferred to stay during most of Edward's rule. He did not spend a lot of time in London. And there was also this concern about this pattern moving forward of removing ineffective monarchs. So he tried to be adhere to the law very strictly, and some people believed he was too harsh. There are a lot of conspiracies at court. In particular, William Hastings, who was very close to Edward IV, was not happy with Richard's decisions. Richard's cousin, the Duke of Buckingham, also had his own designs on the throne, so he was working against him. Elizabeth Woodville, the former queen, was very unhappy that her two sons are put in prison, so she actually not only forms an alliance with Hastings, but she reaches out to the Lancastrians as well. Things are really challenging for Richard. It's compounded by the death of his wife, Anne, and shortly after that, the death of their only child, Edward. And then what he starts to hear are rumors of the Lancastrian claim. The only sort of surviving member of the Lancastrian branch is this guy, Henry Tudor. As I'll show you in a second, his claim is really pretty flimsy, but you do still have other Lancastrian nobles who are willing to fight. And Elizabeth in particular then reaches out to Henry Tudor and offers him an alliance. So this is Henry's claim. He is a descendant of Catherine of Valois. So King Henry V married Catherine of Valois. When Henry V dies young, she remarries a man named Owen Tudor, who is actually the clerk of her wardrobe. It was a secret marriage because of the status differentiation, but eventually they revealed it. Edmund, their son, had married Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort was a descendant of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. So this is the father of Henry IV, but through an illegitimate line, through his mistress. And so the Beaufort family had been acknowledged by the Pope as eligible for succession to noble titles, but not to the crown. But Margaret married Edmund, and their son Henry then is the Henry Tudor who becomes the Lancastrian claim to the throne. So on August the 2nd, with the backing of French forces, Henry invades. Although his claim is really very weak, there are a lot of nobles who want a weak king because they feel like it gives them a lot more opportunity to advance their own agendas. They're not happy with the sort of way Richard III is exercising authority. They feel like he's being too harsh. And with the money of the King of France, Louis XI, who will do anything to sort of undermine England, Henry does have a sizable force coming from Wales. Richard meets Henry's forces at the Battle of Bosworth. A lot of his counselors encourage him that if he just sort of ignores him, Henry will go away, but he wants to make sure there's no sort of challenge to his rule. When they meet at the Battle of Bosworth, Richard leads his own forces into battle, just like many of his predecessors. Henry does not. He watches the battle from a fair remove. And one of the forces that had been supporting Richard since his coronation has actually been in negotiations with Henry. He betrays Richard on the field of battle. When Richard sees that he's outnumbered, he tries to personally take down Henry. He is surrounded, he is pulled from his horse, and he is killed. So with the death of Richard, there really isn't a clear adult in a position to continue to claim the Yorkist throne. And so this allows Henry VII to march to London. He marries Edward IV and Elizabeth's daughter Elizabeth, so joining the houses of Lancaster and York in an attempt to sort of move forward past some of these divisions. The vast majority of the Plantagenets who are still alive, one by one, are killed off, so that by 1525 they're gone. This is either through accusations of treason or through failed rebellions. Ultimately, what we see, the impact of the Cousins' War, is it really does undermine the authority of the monarchy. If the king can really be one of many individuals, what really gives him the right to rule? Obviously, the violence has been sort of limited to these large-scale conflicts, but it spills over into the countryside. Villages, towns become collateral damage. Trade is disrupted. As long as the nobility, including the king, are fighting, they're not able to ensure that justice is seen. So you really start to see the shift in the nobility as a destabilizing force rather than as one that ensures good government. And the importance of a secure succession, this is going to be something moving forward. Having a male child for a dynasty as young as the Tudors is going to be a lot of what motivates Henry VIII, Henry VII's son, with Elizabeth Woodville pictured here, to do the things that he does. So in terms of consolidation, so Warwick, Gloucester, and Clarence, these are the primary lords on the Yorkist side. All of their lands are confiscated. Their revenues diverted to fill the king's treasury. Henry does move in the future, try to prevent individual nobles from becoming too powerful. So he limits the number of retainers. So these are sort of men who are loyal to you. You pay for their room and board, and in return for that, they provide you loyalty and military service. So he really limits the number of these retainers that these nobles are able to support. Even if they have the means, he doesn't let them do that, so they don't have these private armies. He also prevents families from becoming too powerful by sort of combining forces through marriage. As a result of all the death, as well as some of this confiscation of lands, we know that prior to the Cousins' War, you have about 600 noble families in England. That number is down to 30. However, it doesn't mean that wealth has been shifted to other sectors of the population. They still own about 95% of the wealth of England. It just is concentrated in the hands of fewer families, though the ability of those families to kind of join forces and undermine the authority of the king is very limited. So what you start to see with the next sort of phase is Henry really investing in bureaucratic government, in attempting to limit the power of the nobles to challenge him, and in really ensuring justice as sort of the key to stability across England.